everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. We're here to kind of give you some overview of the latest edition of New Polity magazine. And the guy that always tells me I can't eat on the podcast because it's hard for fixing audio is gone. So I'm going to eat. I'm starving. And somebody left some cake in a little thing. So this is proof. I'm going to show them that I can speak clearly and articulately while eating cake.
That'll be fun.
So
this edition of the journal is, or
so pretty,
magazine, is the technology issue. So most of the articles in this one, I'm blanking on the word, reprints.
Yeah.
Reprints. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So just a collection of essays that we thought were really good at breaking open the technology paradigm. And by we, I mean Marc, because I did not pick any of these out.
That's true. But we got Ratzinger, David L. Schindler, Neil Postman, Michael Hamby, Ivan Illich, Walter Ong, all delivering what I think are great critiques for beginning to understand the Catholic critique of technology. A lot of people think there is no Catholic critique of technology, but I say it's just because we haven't really talked about it enough yet. It's there.
Well, I think, it's just, I mean, I do think it's there, but people don't know what to do about it, just because I think, a common reaction I've seen is, if you have a critique of technology, then it means that you obviously don't want to live with it. Or if you have a critique of car or smartphone or whatever, it just means that you have to completely abandon it from your life.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Catholic Church, people that are seriously Catholic these days, are obviously tending towards Ludditism, becoming much more technology adverse. I mean, it's really actually hard these days to find someone who pairs like a sincere Catholicism with a genuine openness to technological innovation just as it comes. So it seems that there's something baked into the faith that makes us a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe we're just bringing our Catholic guilt into it, where we're like, this is so cool, it must be bad. But it seems to me like there's more going on there.
Okay, this is a dumb question. I know I've heard the word Ludditism. I mean, I know it from context, but now I'm questioning
Luddites.
Whether or not I know what it is.
Luddites were some weavers, they worked on looms around the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, and they were basically trying to protect their own trade from mechanization. And one of the ways that they did this was that they smashed a bunch of mechanical looms. I don't know the details of the story exactly, but it all seems pretty legit to me. But it became a term of condemnation, as in what it came to mean was someone that resists new technology for its own sake. Like they're simply
so it's not a more nuanced social critique.
No, it's a very mean term.
It's all bad.
Yeah, it's bad. But lately, it's like, you know how this happens, where fashions change, and a word that was real mean now is something that you take pride in.
So now it's fashionable.
It's somewhat, yeah. There was a recent report on like the new Luddites from the New York Times. You know how the New York Times sometimes reports on things happening in New York City as if it's representative of like the world. So they reported on some like people that use dumb phones and meet at some hip place in Brooklyn or whatever, and we're like, see, the youth are rejecting the evils of technology, but I don't know about that.
Yeah.
It can become a designer lifestyle for sure. However, what we're here to talk about is to defend what I think is the fundamental wisdom that comes out of the church's reflections on technology. And what that can be broken down to is something pretty reasonable. I think anyone would agree with this, that the problem is never really this or that particular technological device.
Mm-hmm.
Now, look, there's obviously devices that can only be used for evil things, right?
Right.
But even then, you can imagine, just some like horrible device for killing people. Like you could probably still use it as a doorstop, right? So there's nothing in its like there-ness, its physical presence, that somehow makes it itself, evil. But in its design, it can have evil ends, sure. But what it seems like the church takes umbrage of it in these thinkers and beyond is the idea of technology making up for a lack in creation and a lack in humanity especially. The idea that technology isn't a post-fall reality that we utilize to meet this or that particular need, but is rather the very nature of man is to remedy his essentially defective creation, the way he was created, through the creation of technological devices. And this might seem kind of vague, but what I mean is simply that what modernity tends to do is not to create devices to solve this or that problem, right? Not to meet a particular problem with a particular technology, but to always universalize any given technology until it becomes necessary, until it becomes the dominant mode of living. So the car is a really good example. Like the car is not something that's somehow wicked in itself, right? But a world in which everyone needs a car, as if the kind of mobility we had was defective in itself.
Oh, I see.
And so we must have cars in order to remedy the defective human. This is essentially a curse against God as creator. And so what a lot of these folks are talking about is the way in which the spirit of technological innovation is in fact this deep pessimism, like a profound...
Like a view that the human person on their own is insufficient, or the way in which we normally function has to be remedied. I mean, contraceptives are kind of like that. Totally. Like human sexuality is defective on its own, so we have to remedy that.
Yeah, like it's just, women were just badly built. We talked about that a little with the gender stuff. We're back to gender. No, I mean, contraception was actually given the big no-no by Humane Vitae. Who wrote that? That's right. That's exactly what he did. And what he said was fascinating. He said that man should not abdicate his responsibility through technical means. So right there from the beginning of this critique, there's an understanding of contraception, not just as being bad because it is bad for...
Well, one really, I don't know, kind of like stupid argument that I've heard is like, well, it's unnatural. It's like, well, yeah, but also so is growing corn in a row.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's also artificial.
Yeah. No. Artifice is awesome.
Yeah.
Artifice is the way that we get to participate in the creation. I mean, you think about a little kid that looks at all the artifices that you make, and he's just thinking that it's all part of one world. It's like, look, there's a tree, there's a skateboard. They don't strike him as one being from God and one being like the machinations of man who's crafty and, builds things independently of God's intention.
The world.
It's just the world.
It's normal.
We make the world. It's awesome.
Well, I wonder, I don't know.
But when we're scared, when we're fearful, and when we think, what I've been given needs to be remedied because I can't trust that I'll have access to good. I can't trust that through the way that the human person flourishes that I will be happy, that I need to try and alter the structures of nature in order to sort of rip from them a security that I wouldn't be able to get through the practice of the virtues, for instance. That's where it becomes problematic.
I wonder if that's the best way to describe it, because you could respond to that reasonably and say, well, actually, we do need to depend on technology. Like, we need shelter, and that's artifice, and that's technology.
Yeah. Right.
Like, you really, I don't know if that's the best way of describing it. I know what I was picking up, I think, well, I guess Hanby and Schindler talk more about this, is the technological vision, like the
paradigm.
The way that in which you like technology becomes absolutized in the way in which you approach the world. It's the world is a thing not to be received but to conquer. Like, you are approaching it with an attitude of fear. Like, maybe this is a better way of doing it, because I think we do need to depend on technology. Like, I think that's just part of what it means to be human. Yeah,
we're not naturalists here.
So, but there's a difference in approaching the world as like this is a given that's good, and what I want to do is discover this thing and the way that it operates and how I operate and how we work together and how I don't know, you like work with the thing as it's given instead of how can I like extrapolate and exploit this thing so that I can get what it is that I want. Um, I don't know if this is a good example. Well, I think gardens are kind of like that. If you think of really beautiful gardens, or if you walk into someone's backyard and it's really beautiful, usually it's not just because they've like flattened the earth and poured concrete over it and extrapolated what they wanted from the backyard, but it's because they actually understood their own backyard, what works with it. They understand plants. I have a neighbor well, her backyard is magical. It's like walking into a magic forest. And it's just a very different experience because she is not approaching the created world as what she can exploit from it, but how she can create, like work with it itself and create something beautiful.
Totally. Yeah, no, I mean, in a certain respect, if all you mean by technology is making, which
isn't that kind of
semantically is odd because technology is a very modern term. It kind of arises with in the Industrial Revolution. But if that's all you mean by it, then we were makers from the beginning.
Yeah.
Like Adam is made to till and keep the garden. And what that means, what that was taken to mean throughout the Christian tradition, was that Adam perfects the nature of things. So because he is more perfect, he is higher, he serves to them as their principle of perfection. So it's not just that his garden is somehow a violence done on the earth. It's the perfection of things that cannot be raised to that level of order, that level of beauty that you saw in your neighbor's backyard. I mean, a garden is always more impressive than even the most glorious of natural meadows, I think. Now, the reason that technology takes on a different term that I would at least, and this is semantics here, I would at least oppose it to making in order to make a distinction, but people don't always mean the same thing. But when we no longer take as the reason for our acting the perfection of nature, but rather when nature is conceived of as being hostile to our own flourishing, and so what we do is we try to manage it, violently suppress certain aspects of it, destroy it, or we use violence in some way in order to carve out for ourselves a certain security. And that's the sort of like, that's why there's always a good attached to every technology, because it really does. I mean, we're not just being dumb here. I mean, like we really do go after particular goods. It's just that the technological attitude is essentially atheistic. It's that God won't provide. Nature is insufficient. Like what God has given is insufficient. The nature is given to me to perfect. I don't have a duty to them per se. I have, first of all, a duty of simply my own survival, which can only be best achieved at enmity with nature as it's given. Like I need to wrestle it to the ground, beat it up, and take from it its coal or its oil or whatever. There's that famous quote, and it was in Hanby's article, which was just marvelous, but I think he was quoting Francis Bacon. Actually, I'm going to pull it up because it's worth reading before we go into some of the other texts. But
Can you find it? What page is it on?
I don't know. That's why I'm shuffling around here.
That's why I said when you find it.
You're supposed to take this time to talk about something else while I look for this horrible quote from Francis Bacon. Oh.
Well, I was thinking about something I don't think it'll be too long to get into. It's just on my mind because I'm teaching some students a morality class. We were talking about Genesis, but with the idea of nature being hostile, like the idea of thorns existing before the fall or not was something that we talked about. Because I know that Aquinas believes that there were always thorns. The creation was creation, but it just wasn't experienced essentially as a hostile enemy. And I think there's certain church fathers that when they read Genesis, like their symbolic image of it is the mountain with the tree of life at the top, and the thorns are always present within the garden, but they're always pictured down at the bottom of the mountain and kind of surrounding it like a wall. Like it's a protection.
Oh wow!
And so
cool.
Before the fall, it was creation was experienced as like, oh, here's this protective barrier for myself. But then when they're kicked out of the garden, suddenly the thorns became an enemy to them. So that kind of follows the same paradigm.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the governing principle there was wisdom, right? So man in his original state has by grace the wisdom to know things in their nature. And because of that, he knows what a thorn is for. And nothing that God gives is ever a obstacle, a scandalon to man.
Right. And not to bring this, well, I know we weren't
I couldn't
going to
find
talk
the quote,
about,
so it's fine.
we weren't going to talk about contraceptive the whole time, but to bring it back to that, I mean, that's, I think, completely what women experience their bodies as. Like, my body is an enemy, and so I have to control it instead of working with the way that it naturally functions. So then if your body is the enemy, then you do need technology to control it.
Yeah,
and to make it into a thing that it, questionably wasn't supposed to be in the first place.
Yeah, and then it gets super weird because I think within a world in which nature is presumed to be deficient, it's very paradoxical because on the one hand, you have people who need technology to affirm that their bodies now have worth of some kind. So their bodies need to be modified in some way, precisely in order to be the work of human hands. So you can see this fear of like the given, because the given is precisely what all of culture says, like, we got to deal with the given in a way that makes sure that we can scratch as much life out of it as possible for us. So that means that our own view of our given bodies has that same kind of need for the evidence of being an artifice as opposed to being something natural. But then paradoxically, what it also does is it gives rise to naturalism. So the idea that sort of like nudism, like it's like the equal and opposite reaction in some ways, that you have precisely in the most technologically modifying anti-nature world, you have precisely people who say like, we don't need to make anything. All we need to do is, we don't need to wear clothes. We don't, like, everything you have is perfectly good. There's no problems. You should live and sleep under the stars. This kind
Just go be hippies and hug trees.
Yeah, which is obviously the same sort of problem because you're still positing the human person as an artifice, almost just as like a really good artifice. Like, it's really durable. It's more than you think, which is obviously not true. It's like what we need is the right relationship to technology. We don't need an absolutization of it. We need to be able to use it for problems. It's such a simple idea, but I maintain that it's profound. I maintain that because we live in a fallen age, it's harder to perfect natures than it once was.
Right.
And that includes our own. And so everything is sick and in need of a doctor, right? And so it's not that technology is bad, but it's that it should be limited in its application to actually solving particular problems. It's like a bridge is a technology. Yeah. Right. But the problem that we have, it's like if you can imagine a world in which someone builds a bridge, makes a bunch of money off the fact, and says, I'm going to market bridges everywhere. Bridges, they're the next big thing. Everyone's going to have a bridge wherever, Which you laugh, but it's like, it's precisely what we do wherever we can. Namely, take something that's for the solution of a particular need, and then instead make it into something that everyone must use. Phones are an obvious example. There can be a need of long-distance communication at an instance, but what we have now is a world in which it is impossible to live in a normal way without the technology.
Okay.
Well, this is where Illich comes in, I think.
I was going to make that transition. Oh. Dang.
Sorry, dude.
So there's two articles from Illich, and both of them are from the same book, right?
That's Ivan Illich. So for those who didn't get to enjoy us talking about him sort of stutteringly and haltingly on the Gender podcast, this is our dear radical critic of modernity. He was a priest. He had some heretical ideas and kind of walked away from the priesthood in some ways, but don't let that stop you reading him, because he is truly one of the most honest writers that I've ever read, and one of the most challenging. Like he will always take a critique to the point of no return. Like he will critique modernity to the point where you have to ask yourself why you don't just kill yourself right now. And so you have to be willing to go through that with him. So he wrote 2 pieces that we included here. They're Disabling Professions, which is from his book, The Right to Useful Unemployment, which I love the title. And then Energy and Equity, which is the title of a book. It's really an essay. It's been published as a book, but it's really an essay, and we took a portion from it called The Industrialization of Traffic and went from there.
Got it. Well, I thought we'd begin with the second one on disabling professions, although that one was a little bit more difficult to read. Just kind of seemed like he used a lot of jargon that was kind of slow to slog through.
Yeah, and part of this is the effect of it coming, halfway into a conversation.
Right.
But I think you could probably lay out his basic claim here.
Yeah. So kind of what you were talking about with like absolutizing technology, it's not just solving a particular problem, but making it, I guess, like everyone's problem and everyone's solution. And he's using that to critique professionalism, which, we think we've all experienced. Trying to find a good quote to pull.
Yeah, I mean, his biggest critique is one that I think we've all experienced, which is namely that we live in a world in which professional standards and certifications, that's how you say that word, increasingly provide an absolute barrier between the person and his own capacities and then his ability to actually act in the world. To the point where it's almost seen as criminally irresponsible sometimes to do things that don't have professional certification behind them. So one example that I always think of is you're basically insane if you try to do your own electric work. And even it's illegal in some places in America. Like you just can't do it. Or for instance, it's insane and you should be frowned upon for not going through the hospital system to give birth. That's a really big one.
Right. Yep.
Or so basically things that often human beings have done,
or things that we can do, but things that we're not allowed to do because we don't have a piece of paper. And like on the one hand, like it's there for a reason because there are a lot of incompetent people and there are a lot of people who are evil, and you want to prevent that, obviously. But not everyone is in that actual position.
Yeah. So this is where it's a sort of a delicate critique because, obviously it's the case that people are sinful, stupid, incompetent, and malicious. Yep. Some of the time. The trouble with a technological society is it can only ever think in terms of mass solutions and absolute answers.
So it has to bend to the lowest common denominator.
Right, absolutely. So you have, instead of the idea that, okay, there are some people who have let's use the birth example. So there's some people who are quacks and who in their efforts at midwifery are in fact putting lives in danger or something like that. And they should be rooted out and destroyed. Oh, that might be excessive. Told to stop doing what they're doing. Instead of that being the response, when you're trying to govern on a mass scale, there's simply an unrealistic ability to do that, right? You cannot investigate every instance, right? Right. Now, there's 2 types of people in the world when they face this problem, namely that you cannot govern every instance, right? There are the people who think technologically for a technological solution, and then there's people that think socially for a social solution. And by and large, I'm only friends with the latter group. Okay. But that's not what we're here to talk about. No. The technological mind says something to the effect of, well, then we need a mechanism that applies to everyone, so that in one gesture, the governing body, the state, the professional institution, whatever it is, can create a system by which only those competent practitioners come to be at all, right?
Right.
The other mindset, the social mindset, says something to the effect of, well then, we have a problem with our society. If it's the case that governance is happening at a level in which incompetent people can't be punished, if it is the case where
that we cannot do the thing that we want to do,
we can't do it because of the scale we're operating at, then we should be operating at a smaller scale. So it would go precisely the opposite direction. Like, well, let's distribute power and authority so that there are people who have authority over midwives at a smaller level, say, in this instance, so that can actually be judged, as opposed to saying, let's find a technocratic solution.
But if you already start moving in that direction, then your apparatus just has to get larger and larger and more centralized. Because I mean, if that's the route that you're going to go, that's the only way that it's going to be effective.
Yeah, you got to really do it big or go home.
Yeah,
go big or go home. And the thing is, because America, especially, and we're talking about America here, but obviously it would apply to any big old nation, because we've already made the decision to go big. We have to keep on.
We're stuck.
We have to keep on going big. Which we'll talk more about whether that leads to hopelessness or not. But so what Illich is noticing is the increased impotence of the person on their own 2 feet. The increased impotence of the person, not necessarily just as an individual. He's criticized of individualism sometimes, but I think he has smaller social units in mind as well. That because of these. Because of the and to be clear, I think he thinks people are well motivated at the beginning, in the sense of they really are driven because they're trying to stop bad things from happening. Yeah. To create degrees of professional certification. But the trouble with mechanism is that it outlasts people, whereas judgment and authority, it's constantly represented by a person. Something like a mechanism of certification is, well, it's a mechanism. And so it can operate even when it no longer is reasonable. It has, Aquinas talks about the law and how law always has to be dispensable according to person and circumstance. So that means any kind of human ordinance of reason, and I would include all technological apparatuses under that, have to be open to be good, to be moral, have to be open to a moment where you say, okay, in this instance, it doesn't apply. And that is by definition what a technological society cannot do.
Yeah, okay.
You cannot have a person who can judge the particular circumstance because it's operating for odd ends and at too large of a scale.
Right.
So what you end up with is people being the victim of bureaucratic and mechanical situations, which poisons them against, the idea of government and authority and the society as a whole. It's sad.
Well, one of the examples that I wanted to talk about is education, and mostly because I can speak to that more personally, because I was an educator. I taught high school for 2 years. And I just remember feeling very cynical about the education major in particular, because I ended up teaching high school without an ed degree because I went to school for theology. But then most people that I knew had gotten an ed degree, and they had gone through this giant certification process. But then when they came out the other end of it, they're like, yeah, it was mostly useless. It was mostly a waste of money and mostly a waste of time. There are some there's legitimately helpful things that you learn. But it didn't take 4 years and that amount of cash to get those. And the other thing that I noticed is that the best educators that I had didn't go through that certification process. They just studied philosophy. They became professors at the end of it. And Illich is pointing out that, we have a certification process where self-education is not legitimate. I mean, you can have legitimate knowledge and you can actually be competent, but because you don't have a piece of paper to prove it, then like you can't get a job, or you're not considered a professional, and so your opinion doesn't count, and the expertise you have is not real,
and there's no one to judge your particular circumstance, so you're just out. No, I think that is exactly what we're talking about. The management of society as a mechanism is done for the sake of apparently reducing incompetence. But what anyone who's actually lived for a little while knows is that it also allows for incompetence, because the very same gesture that puts certain sort of mechanical steps in place in order to receive a degree or to receive certification as a building inspector or to receive whatever you want, to the same degree that it makes it impersonal and for everyone, it allows people to game the system by attaining those steps through means that don't ever require real knowledge.
Right.
Now, we see this very obviously with just straight bribery, for instance. Like, my kid has a certification. I paid, the Ivy League school to get him in. So there's that. But there's also just the ability to do tests well, to fill out the forms, to show up to the sort of various online training seminars. I mean, if anyone's gone through like even like the fast food industry, right, where you get certified in safety training because you watched a video or something, they know that a society that tries to get personal results through impersonal means is doomed to fail. You do not produce virtue by a system in which there's no teacher, like there's no master inviting you into the skill, into the knowledge, but just having a certification process.
Right. So you're not actually training people in competence. You're just training people to be really good at following the rules.
Right, exactly. And what's fascinating...
And rewarding people who do that too. Just rewarding people who aren't thinking and just start checking all the boxes.
Yeah, and obviously some boxes that are checked have to involve thinking. Like, I'm not saying that there's an illegitimacy to testing generally or something like that. But what is the case is that there are different kinds of people. And the lie of a bureaucratically organized society, like the one Illich is talking about here, is that it produces equality, right? Okay, everyone has to go through the same system to get the same results, right? If you want to drive, everyone has to do these.
Therefore, everyone is like equal and is on equal footing.
Get this license. Yes, exactly. But what actually happens is that you create a society in which people who are adept at navigating bureaucracies succeed disproportionately to those who are not so adept. And it is not a moral failing to be inept at navigating bureaucratic systems. It is not a moral failing to be a bad test taker, for instance. It is not a moral failing to be bad at sort of the production of a constant CV that, accords well with mechanical ways of choosing different people for jobs. So, like, for instance, one of the problems in our town is that when people are looking for a job, they often, because of the various reasons, which kind of boil down to poverty, they don't have a driver's license or an ID. So you need to be the certain kind of person that's raised in the certain kind of way to not see this as simply part of your exclusion from a wealthier, richer, and more competent society, but to actually see the idea that you're all equal before the law and that you just happen to be in some place where you don't have the necessary ID that everyone else has, and then to engage the bureaucracy as an act of will, because it's not easy, right? You gotta get a ride, gotta face the bureaucrat who scares you, and you have to, hear what they need from you. So I take someone up to get a state ID. They say, oh, sorry, he can't have a state ID because he needs 3 other forms of ID in order to get the state ID. Now, 3 other forms of ID he doesn't have, not through any fault of his own, but because his parents didn't
save the documents.
Okay, so now we're going back and we're calling Social Security Administration and we're saying, hey, I need this form of ID to get that form ID. So how do I get a Social Security card? And they say, well, you need this form of ID, which of course he doesn't have, right? And there's people that are good at this sort of thing, right? They're good at keeping track of things. It's one of their gifts. It's not me, but it's one of their gifts. There's people that are really good at seeing a series of obstacles, like 17 different ones, and being willing, having that kind of thrill of, I'm going to accomplish A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and then come out at the end.
These are the people who get like real satisfaction from crossing things off lists.
There's list people.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
You're not a list person.
I am not a list person. It makes me feel exhausted. I hate lists.
Yeah.
I mean, I have them because I need them.
Now here's the point. Within a society in which like we assure our own security by setting mechanical systems of certification in front of every good, which is, I think, an accurate description, and believe ourselves to be doing this, because it's the most convenient way of getting rid of, malicious actors. We inevitably reward people who are naturally good at operating that sort of society. Because the thing about humanity is we keep on having kids. So people are born again and have to face the thing we've built. And not everyone's as up to it as the last person. Now, it might sound like I'm making a sort of appeal for like the disorganized artist type as like the victim of society. But actually, it's the fact that our society allows people to glory in the disorganized artist victim thing that makes it so repulsive. It's like, what I'm saying is not only are certain people disabled from the get-go by the way that we've made it so that systems don't have any consideration of person and circumstance, but also even the people who are good at the systems, they end up disproportionately leading the bureaucratic organization itself. So what I mean is, if you're really good,
if you are that kind of person, then you end up leading that kind of system.
You become a lawyer, right? Or you become really good at insurance or something like that. But I find that is also a disabling of the possibilities for that type of mind. I mean, like that idea of a mind that's really good at discerning a multitude of rules and following them and keeping them all organized, that is a musical mind. That has a sort of glory to it, a creativity to it, a sort of fractal understanding of things. I listen to like the music of Bach sometimes, like the fugues, and I get this sense like, oh yeah, this is not an artist who's like disheveled and disorganized. This is like a meticulous mathematical mind at work, producing some of the most beautiful compositions that you could imagine.
Right. So are you saying that like the bureaucratic system starts rewarding list people essentially, and then like the creativity that they do have is just like pigeonholed in
because
boxes?
the only thing more dangerous than failure in a corrupt society is success, because the ability to succeed at managing a machine built for mass society does give you rewards of like more money basically, but it's crippling to the human spirit. I mean, who has met someone that is really good at bureaucratic management that is like happy in their bureaucratic job, like working for the IRS or something? I at least I haven't, and it's because it seems like there's a by making what is essentially a technological solution that might apply in a certain particular circumstance into the way that we protect ourselves generally, we create really shortened possibilities for human life. It's like certain people aren't going to do very well, and certain people are only going to get so far before they run up against their own inability.
Right.
And then people who are really good at it are going to appear and will be rewarded as being operators of the system.
Well, what I was going to say earlier is that they really do appear as being virtuous. Like it creates a new virtue paradigm where the virtuous person is someone who is good at navigating the system and following the rules. And so you create a person whose interior life is being valued on qualifications that aren't actually moral, but are just certain skills that are good for this system. And then I think like we actually start interpreting it that way, even as like Christians. Like I think a lot of people, like the reason why they're unimpressed with Christianity is because like we're living in a bureaucratic mindset where like to be a good Christian means to be good at checking off all the boxes. It means to be like a list person. It means to be good at following the system and following the rules. And it doesn't mean like this is a person who is courageous and can actually make judgments and judge the law or judge the system in any way.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, that's a very boring, it's just very, very boring. Like, of course, like people are turned off from that kind of bureaucratic Christianity.
Yeah, no, it fits.
I mean, like you experience
it
that
fits
as a
too well
kid.
with the world.
You experience it as a kid. Like you want to be like a good person. You know that, but like you're confronted with choices, and like you start believing that certain things are like moral failures or like are wrong when they're actually not. I think you had a couple good examples that we were talking about earlier. I'm trying to remember. Sorry, put you on the spot. I know. Well, I know like one. I guess this would kind of come up more in the car conversation. But like as a kid, like you have an immense like feeling of guilt for trespassing on someone's property.
Totally.
But that's not actually a moral failure to want to cut through the neighbor's yard. But you experience it as such.
Totally. Yeah, I think about the way in which impersonality is generally rewarded, and how basically I think women are punished in this whole system.
Right.
No surprise. Okay, look, this is the argument. All I'm saying is, if it's true, as many people have said, that women are more concerned in spirit with personal relationships.
This is true.
Okay. You said it.
Yep.
And you're a woman, so I have no more responsibility for the claim.
Okay.
If that's the case, then it seems to me that a world that assures its security by the implementation of impersonal norms is worse for women than it is for men, generally speaking. Obviously, there's exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
And I've experienced this with my wife, in that, she can be the victim of the most impersonal of possible processes. Like,
right.
I drive through a toll booth.
Okay.
Don't pay. Say.
For instance.
Gets a ticket, goes to the wrong house. Say. Gets a fine. Fine comes later. All of this having been achieved by computers.
Right.
Right. At no point was my wife considered personally as a person and a circumstance that could even be considered. She was never even thought of. Mm-hmm. And yet when the thing finally arrives, like the reprimand, which we all experience, right? We all experience the bureaucratic reprimand, even when it is actually as much a reprimand as like a rock hitting another rock that, that doesn't work. That analogy doesn't work. Even when it's totally automated.
Yeah.
She experiences it as a personal rebuke. I mean, she cannot distance herself from the kind of meaning that thing would have
if it was coming
from
personal. A person. Right.
And I don't think that's like some kind of failing. I think that's actually one of the greatest things about women generally, which is that they kind of refuse to be disassociated with the world of persons. Mm-hmm. And so the world becomes, I think, more, people talk about this in different ways. Like, men are better at compartmentalizing, or we can shut off certain parts. And I think there's a certain truth to that, but I think it's more that we're talking about the contrasting reality of the female, mm-hmm. who is, they say Eve was the one who woke up and the first thing she saw was another person, mm-hmm. right? Whereas Adam is the one that wakes up and looks onto the world. And I think that there's something to that personality is punished in some way. So that's my example of things that feel like they're really bad, but in fact. And, Andrew's talked about this. He's sort of citing Foucault, that the conspiracy behind all this is that these norms, these processes of certification, are only on the face of it for the safekeeping of people from bad actors. Mm-hmm. But they have this secondary purpose that really drives them, which is the production of people that don't make the certification. So it's a production mm-hmm. of an underclass that allows us to live a kind of faux morality in the absence of a Christian social order, mm-hmm. whereby goodness becomes having successfully follow the rules.
Right.
And badness becomes things like that person who doesn't have a car and is walking in a weird place. Isn't he disgusting? You know what I'm saying? Like we find new ways to live a life of being elect versus being damned because we need to, because that's who we really are.
Right.
But we very conveniently take away the actual theological mystery there and make it into, well, you're saved if you saved a certain amount of money every month from when you were 8 years old, and now you're getting great returns on your what's it?
Yeah.
Whereas you irresponsible moron who didn't do that, well, now you're damned.
Yeah.
So, but before we move on, I think Illich, there's two things from the essay, just in case you think that we're just talking about what we think, that he mentions that's pretty important. So one of them is the idea that of what he calls radical monopoly, or
it's on 74.
74. Yeah. So legalized control over work, things like this, where basically he talks a lot about the production of needs, that needs that are simultaneous with their fulfillment, and how the professions often arise, like the feeling of their necessity often arises because they're meeting a need that
because they're
has
telling
existed,
you that you have a need.
because they're telling you have the need, exactly. And he's so very resistant to this. So, an obvious example is like medical advertising and such. Are you sleepy? Do you sometimes feel a little bit off, like the world's gone a little purple? Well, have we got the drug for you? Where you make the need vague enough that you're kind of just describing part of the human condition. He says the same thing in this about therapists, that it used to be like, in the criminally insane that would need something like a psychiatrist and now it's basically fashionable to have one, where the need and its fulfillment is both imputed and then resolved by one and the same profession.
There's a quote at the bottom of 74. So he writes that professionals, or the professional class, they claim special incommunicable knowledge, not just about the way things are and are to be made, but also about the reasons why their services ought to be needed. Merchants sell you the goods they stock. Guildsmen guarantee quality. Some craftspeople tailor their product to measure your fancy. Professionals, however, tell you what you need. So the middle bit about the guildsmen and the craftspeople who are like tailoring their product to what it is that you need, like that's technology as like fulfilling a need. Like you come to them like, I am this size and this shape, can you make it? Whereas the opposite mentality is the professional who claims this special incommunicable knowledge, tells you this is the thing that you need and you need it in this way. And so you become dependent upon them instead of them looking at you in your particular circumstance and in your need and offering their expertise to you, I guess.
Yeah. No, you see this all the time in like when you have to get drawings for a certain project that like an architect does, even though you could do it yourself with no problem. I mean, the idea is always, of course, that there's some worst case scenario, but that's all the mechanism is oriented towards, and not the case scenario where you say, hey, I can do this competently. It's like, well, that's not really the question within a technocratic society. Yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah, I liked how he was describing it as a monopoly. Yeah, just a helpful image.
Yeah, I'll read a part that kind of goes through it. So he says, when I learned to speak, presumably this is like 30s maybe, problems existed only in mathematics or chess. Solutions were sailing, like a sailing solution, or legal. And need was mainly used as a verb. The expressions I have a problem or I have a need both sounded silly. As I grew into my teens and Hitler worked at solutions, the social problem also spread. Problem children of ever newer shades were discovered among the poor as social workers learned to brand their prey and to standardize their needs. Need, used as a noun, became the fodder on which professions fattened into dominance. Poverty was modernized. Management translated poverty from an experience into a measure. The poor became needy. The idea here is that people, for the sake of their own security, create their own necessity, right? Mm-hmm. So he uses examples in other places of villages where people happily built their houses according to no particular method. They built shelter. That's what they did. And then a body, some professional body, observing, this is in Mexico, observing these standards, said, well, these are dangerous, these are unsafe, these are the norms by which a house can be constructed, and it's implemented. So now what was poverty, right, which is to say a house built by people with little money, right, becomes illegal. So now the same houses are criminal houses. So you're not allowed to build in that way. And this is what he talks about when he talks about the modernization of poverty. It's that there is a kind of poverty where, because nature is abundant and because social help is real, people can get along and get by.
Yeah, people can make do.
And then there's a kind of poverty that operates on the basis of measure that says things like, well, you need this much income, you need to have this sort of way of living. And then it imputes, usually through goodwill, like it wants to resolve poverty, it imputes the needs. It's like now these people are both the object of police action and charity. Like, hey, they need their houses. Like, look at them. They're suddenly living in a disaster zone where, of course, they've been doing that for a long time quite peacefully. But
yeah.
So he has this keen awareness of the way that we can create the needs at the same time as offering the solution to them. And so I think if he has an ideal here, it's that we don't create needs. We let people speak their own needs. Like, and that's why he says it's not a noun, it's a verb, right? It's not like a thing people have apart from them actually saying, I need, a roof that doesn't leak or something like that.
Right. I like the next sentence too. During the second half of my life, to be needy became respectable. That's just become more and more the norm. Like to have a need is now a sign of social competence. Like it's a part of navigating the bureaucratic system, knowing like what your needs are. And navigating the system to fulfill them. Well, anything else that you want to say about that one?
Nope, I think it's great.
Professionals.
I mean, I could just read him because he's great. Increasingly, needs are created by the advertising slogan and by purchases made by order from registrar, beautician, gynecologist, and dozens of other prescribing diagnosticians. They need to be formally taught how to need, be this by advertising, prescription, or guided discussion in the collective or in the commune. As people become apt pupils in learning how to need, the ability to shape wants from experience satisfaction becomes a rare competence of the very rich or the seriously undersupplied. That's very important, actually. As people become apt pupils in learning how to need, the ability to shape wants from experience to satisfaction becomes a rare competence. I find this to be so true. Like, people don't actually even know, like, the danger about giving people their needs is you disable them from the start from being able to sort of dive into the real and find what they really want, like what
Mm-hmm.
satisfies them and what doesn't. Like you have people through a whole slew of advertising who are all after mental health, right? Like
Right.
they need mental health, they have to have it. And what this expresses to some degree is just this inability to be living a life that you can express your own needs for yourself. It's like you use the jargon of what people give you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, that kind of reminds me of what he says in the other essay about being a perpetual passenger. This attitude of dependence, like you create a certain helplessness. Like if you're told that you have all of these needs and it's this professional class that is able to provide for those needs, well, since you don't have those skills or competence on paper, then it puts you in a place of perpetual dependence and perpetual helplessness. And I think a lot of people do feel that way.
Yeah. I definitely have felt that way before.
Yeah.
You want to talk about the cars?
Yes. Let's talk about the cars.
It's all about cars, baby. So the second essay that we want to talk about, energy inequity, is one of the best essays in the world. Here, Illich argues that cars make you slow, and he spends a long time justifying this seemingly impossible claim. And he does it in a couple different ways,
right,
which I think we can go through.
Yeah.
So he's making that argument that cars make you slow, and then he's also making the argument that increased speed, so like the ability to move faster, has as its direct consequence a hierarchy of means of transportation.
Right.
So if we start operating at higher speeds, what we will really be doing is limiting travel by a certain speed to a certain class of people.
Yeah, at the end he says, tell me how fast you go and I'll tell you who you are.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just think about it for a second, you know it's true.
Totally true. If you're really poor, you're walking.
Yeah.
And really like quite out of it, you're walking. And then you might be able to get a bicycle, and then you move up to car. And well, actually, no, you move to the bus system, and then cars.
Right.
So, how does he make this argument? Well, he basically says,
do we want to start with that one, or do we want to start with the first one that he talks about?
What's that?
The first one is just about walking.
Oh yeah.
Like cars are supposed to. I mean, cars are supposed to make us faster and save time. And his first point is like, look, well, we actually on average walk about as many miles as our ancestors. It's just through parking lots, and through giant department stores. And so you have this illusion of being in the place where you need to be, but because the place that you are at is so massive, you end up walking the same amount anyway. Yeah,
and I should say we're definitely talking about America here. I can't say this for everywhere else, but yeah, it's true. One of the difficulties we have sometimes in our little town is convincing people about this fact, because it seems very paradoxical. So sometimes people will say, well, you can't close down the street and make it pedestrian here because people won't want to walk from their cars that they park elsewhere all the way to where you are. And what I've done before to help with this argument is I've gone to Walmart, parked my car in a normal spot, and taken one of these wheels that click every time there's a foot. No, it is very dorky, but and just measured the distance from my car to where, not to the entrance of Walmart, but to what I wanted in Walmart. I forget what I got, but I went and got something.
Okay.
And I was walking more than 2 city blocks, to get in to, you know what I mean? So I was walking more to take a car somewhere and go to Walmart than I would have had we a pedestrian situation in which I could have purchased the same item.
Right.
So the thing that I had to bring to other people was like, no, you actually walk. You walk a lot. You walk to your car and you walk out of your car and you walk where you arrive. And this hasn't somehow saved us from our feet.
Right.
Nor does Illich say, would we want really to be saved from our feet? So he says, people on their feet are more or less equal. People solely dependent on their feet move on the spur of the moment at 3 to 4 miles per hour in any direction and to any place from which they are not legally or physically barred. And then he says this, and this is the key distinction to a Catholic understanding of technology from other understandings. An improvement on this native degree of mobility, walking, by new transport technology should be expected to safeguard these values and to add some new ones, such as greater range, time economies, comfort, or more opportunities for the disabled. So what he's arguing there is sort of formally important, which is that what modernity tends to do is take some particular value and say, look how much this technology can get this particular value, and then just not talk about the fact that it sacrifices a whole host of other values.
Yeah.
So it tends to do this with time and money. So it says you can save two things. You save time and you can save money with the car. Now, what do you lose? You lose beauty. You lose like quiet, right? You lose safety in a lot of ways. But, we just talk about our dominant values, which are time and money. And then these become the ways we argue for the expansion of the technology. So it's just a shell game, right? We say,
and then his point is that you don't actually save time and you don't actually save money.
Oh yeah, no, it's hard to imagine you save money. So the big way, and probably the most important way that you don't end up saving time, is just there is a spreading out of life concomitant to its reachability by automobile.
Right. Oh, I love that point. He's got a line. He says, motorways expand, driving wedges between neighbors, removing fields beyond the distance a farmer can walk. Like instead of having, you don't really have walkable spaces anymore. Like you can't get to things because things are just so spread out. And so suddenly we have created a system where I am utterly dependent on the car because I can't walk that far.
Yeah. I mean, people often do this with technology where they judge it according to the world created in its image, and then they find that it's successful. Right. So they say, yeah, a car helps me see my grandma, and a car gets me to groceries, and a phone lets me communicate with people that I haven't seen in so long. You know what I mean? Like, it's always on the basis of this world, which makes sense. That's what we do. But when you take a step back and realize that modernity is something of an aberration, like it's a new and wicked way of viewing nature as something we need to mine for security, then it becomes more reasonable to look at what we did before and ask, well, what were we doing then? Did we always lack access to grandma? Like, no, like we lived within walkable communities.
Grandma's down the hall.
Yeah, probably. So we live within walkable communities, and so what we're talking about is not a device that has allowed us to meet needs that we have. We're talking about a device that began by first imputing needs, right? So like the whole car thing was sold by this idea of needing to do like liberating cross-country travel and to move at certain speeds. But then the world actually becomes designed with the kind of possibilities people have. It doesn't need to be, but that is in fact what we do. So
yeah. Well, he's got another line about this, which I also love, that, like the car prompts him to consent to the design of his country's geography around vehicles rather than around people.
Yeah, totally. No, it's very obvious. And there's a lot in like the new urbanist movement that's cognizant of this and is critiquing it. So I don't think we're saying anything that would be wildly new to people. The idea of any critique of technologies is a critique of its absolutization, where it no longer simply serves an existing need, but in fact creates a necessity of itself, which by definition means that humanity now has a crutch. Humanity is now weaker.
Right.
It's a paradox, right? Because on the one hand, you think humanity's stronger because aren't we improved? Look at us. We're progressing. We once didn't have cars, now we do have cars. Humanity's better. The other hand, you can just say it differently, which is we once didn't need cars, now we do need cars. Humanity's worse. So every technological development, unless it's governed by virtue,
it's just
decision,
create dependence.
Creates a weaker humanity, weaker and weaker and weaker, until eventually you have the greatest progress in terms of technology and the greatest regress in terms of strength, in terms of humanity, because you need precisely everything that you once didn't.
Yeah, he talks about that image too, like how it creates the habitual passenger. So like, man, like when you're standing on your own 2 feet, you forget that you are the center of your own world and you have the power to go literally wherever you want. But because you have this dependence on cars and you feel an immediate helplessness on your own 2 feet, like I can't get to where I want to go. And I also really liked his point too about how like a world of cars ends up limiting your own freedom on your own 2 feet. Like now you can't cross into the road.
Yeah, becomes real.
Because it's not normal to just walk places. It's weird if you do. Or like I think especially in America we've just become, because we have cars, we become extra, I don't know, like protective of our own property. Like going back to the kid cutting through a neighbor's yard, like that shouldn't be a big deal, but you feel like you've just committed something really wrong, like trespassing on someone's property. But if you live in a world where everyone walks places, that's just what you do. Like I remember when I was in Croatia, I was in a small town. Actually, this was at Medjugorje. Because it wasn't...
Sorry, it's just very typical that you would go to Medjugorje and then what you'd come away with was like a critique of the car.
But I remember walking through these little paths through the houses, like out, like away from the more industrialized part of the town. I mean, at the moment, I just remember thinking that it was really like beautiful, and I remember how freeing it felt just to like walk places and not feel like I was. I mean, at first I did feel kind of weird about it. Like I felt like am I like trespassing? Like there's these houses around. These people probably don't want me here. But that's just how people move. Like I think you have a much greater sense of an adventure that's around you when you can just walk places.
Well, I think the car is the technology that makes liberalism true. And in the regard that you're talking about it makes it true in its presupposition of private property. So what distinguishes liberalism from any other social system on earth is that it really does assert that everything is owned, right? Yeah. Has some problems with rivers, but we'll sure figure that out soon enough. So everything's owned, and everything is owned not in terms of use or anything like that or custom, but in terms of a deed. Now, this is obviously not true because the world is given to everyone, right? And as a kid, you kind of know that because suddenly you're in a different spot, and the adult might see the sign that says, if you trespass, I'll kill you. But the kid can't read yet, and so he's just, moving about. Yeah. But one of the ways to sure as heck approximate a world in which the regime of private property is actually valid is to make a grid, and then on all the lines of the grid, surround it by the possibility of death. Because that's what an American city is, right? It's when you grow up here, you grow up near death. So if you walk here, you may be smushed. If you walk there, you may be shattered. But here, right, is this sort of haven, as it were. And this is what we call home and yard and stuff like that. And so, sometimes Europeans and other people make fun of us for this. Like we have a certain pathological love of like the picket fence and like the yard and this being my spot. But you can see how when you develop a society where the borderlines are all deadly to people on feet, how it affirms the notion of private property as somehow like uncrossable and sacrosanct. It's like if there was a moat with alligators everywhere, you'd probably feel the same. You'd probably feel the same way. And I've always wondered about this, like that. One of the first things I really teach my children once they walk is about the nearness of death at the hands of other people, and how just simply in order to keep them safe, I have to, right? Yeah. And how this must create a kind of person. Like I can't just be giving them a bit of information, right? Yeah. When I say like, okay, death is that way and that way, so please stay here. And I was looking at these pictures of this town in Greece. I forget the name that had cars are banned. Like you can't. Or it's a village. You can't have cars. And it looks beautiful, and the streets are small, and it's all at this human scale, and you can tell that there is just no need for these like empty expanses that are fit for rubber wheels, but not people. But I just couldn't help but thinking like a child would grow up differently here, like, and would be less amenable. It seems to me, just in a basic way, would be less amenable to the kind of ideas that become prevalent in like liberalism, especially like libertarianism, like the idea of nature being a sort of war of all against all, and then the individual having to enter into social compacts where he protects himself against the potential deadliness of his neighbor. It's like, yeah, all of that seems, I think all of that's stupid, but it sure doesn't seem so stupid to a child who's raised in and around death by the neighbor, not as a sort of maliciousness of the neighbor, but as the quotidian functioning of the world.
Yeah, this is just the way things are.
Then to hear something like, yeah, we bind together in social compact in order to reduce the risk to our lives from others, is like, yeah. Yep. It's a violent place out there. Of course, I think this is even more true about abortion, like the idea that we have an operating technology that threatens all life before it's allowed to live. Seems to me like it would very easily create a kind of people for whom liberalism is true. But that's not what we're talking about. The other thing that Illich argues, which I think is just obviously true, is that we think we're saving time, but we spend a lot of time in traffic.
Yes.
Traffic is a word for him that kind of has a formal use. It just means the point at which everyone uses the same thing always means that its efficaciousness is reduced. All right, so if you have the car in a world built for feet, then you are a god among men. Look at you go, faster than everyone else. But if you have a car in a world built for cars, then you're in traffic. Because everyone has, the bar has been raised and everyone has met the bar, and so now you just have the pain of sitting in a car and not moving anywhere. And I think that, so he uses some mathematics, which I'm sure were relevant for his time. He says, the model American male devotes more than 1,600 hours a year to his car. He sits in it while it goes and while it stands idling. He parks it and searches for it. He earns the money to put down on it and meet the monthly installments. He works to pay for gasoline, tolls, insurance, taxes, and tickets. He spends 4 of his 16 waking hours on the road or gathering his resources for it. And this figure does not take into account the time consumed by other activities dictated by transport, time spent in hospitals, traffic courts, and garages, time spent watching automobile commercials or attending consumer education meetings to improve the quality of the next buy. I don't know that we have consumer education meetings anymore, maybe. The model, and this is the great part, the model American puts in 1,600 hours to get 7,500 miles, less than 5 miles per hour. So this is his real argument about speed. He's saying that you cannot judge the speed of a car simply on the basis of any particular point that it's on the road moving. You have to judge it on a total basis of time spent for the sake of enabling even that possibility to have the car and get on the road. When you do that math, you're moving slow. 5 miles per hour, and he had already said the foot was 3 or 4 miles per hour. So what's the point of having a car?
Or one of the things that he says, and I'm not sure I quite understand or can explain what he's getting at. He says, beyond a critical speed, no one can save time without forcing another to lose it. Say, I think in that example, he's talking about. So like in a society where you have things at a human scale and things are walkable, then everyone is kind of in an equal area. As soon as you start introducing speedy technologies, and then the more and more those become popular, then people's mobility starts to decrease as a whole. Well, this is one thing I've noticed about Illich in general that I really appreciate, is that he doesn't just look at individual possibilities. He's very much a realist. So he's not looking at the car and saying, like, well, this means that this amazing possibility opens up for this person. Like, they can go on this like cross-country road trip. What he's more concerned about is the everyday experience for your average person, and in particular for the poor. I think Illich kind of demonstrates what the preferential option for the poor is, like what allows for a good quality of life for your average person, and not just immediately jumping to the ideal of what can this technology ideally offer me.
Yeah, and you can see this really clearly with cars, that once you spread out everything because you are meeting the person who has a car, like you're meeting his need, then the person who doesn't have a car, the poor, lives in a society that is frankly hostile to him. Like for him to get to the grocery store, right? Which maybe it was already difficult just for not having a lot of money to get groceries. But now he is slowed down even more. You know what I'm saying? So I think this is Illich's point, is that as the world develops in relation to a higher and higher speed, it becomes less and less accessible to people that can't afford the product that moves you at that high speed, right? So you can see this all the way up to like a critique of globalism,
right?
Like at a world in which we can hop on an airplane and get to a certain place. I mean, what was the whole Trump phenomenon if not people who couldn't afford global travel and a kind of sort of totally mobile existence from nation to nation, feeling oppressed and left out of an economy that increasingly benefited the people that could. Like I'm sorry, we can't hop on a plane to a factory we own in China or wherever. I guess not China, bad example.
Yeah.
But there's an argument throughout Illich that we are always the faster we go, the more energy we need to go that speed, the higher the cost. When this is the case, that particular speed is only really accessible as a normal way of traveling to people that can afford that kind of energy expenditure.
And that's
other people get to participate in it, but only as a sort of symbolic participation in what's normal for the wealthier.
Right.
So for airplanes, the average family might be able to really save up, afford some plane tickets to go on like a vacation in a year. But the guys in the first class are just on a business trip.
Yeah. Right.
Which is what a poor person does in his car.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like it's and so what you really get is a stricter hierarchizing of an apparently classless society on the basis of what kind of energy expenditures each class has access to.
Right. Yeah. So to kind of bring both of those articles together, like unless you're the sort of person like who can afford a car, that society is built for. Like society is built for those with cars. And then if you don't have a car, then you experience society as being something hostile to you. And same, I think, with like the professions. Like if you're not a person that is good at navigating bureaucratic systems and functions, like maybe it's a personality thing, maybe it's just your situation in life, then you experience society and you experience the world as something that is hostile to you. And I think that's what the left is reacting to. But it seems like the general approach of the left is not to scale down, but just to continue scaling up. And let's the solution seems that the left is proposing is to lift up the poor into the bureaucratic systems.
Yeah, right.
Well, like if they're not good at processing like the bureaucracy, let's make them good at it.
Yeah.
Instead of going the opposite direction.
Yeah, and it comes down to the crucial point that it really matters what we build. It matters what we make, and the way we design the world matters. Like we can't just follow. There's obviously a critique of capitalism going on here, and I think it's worth just pointing out, which is that prior to this idea that man lives by the profit motive in a sort of unrelenting way, there was really not a lot of what we would call technological development the way we mean it now. So you might have something invented that was really awesome, like a windmill in somewhere in medieval Europe where it hadn't been for a while. What doesn't happen is that the guy who makes the windmill says, it's a success. It's a hit. This invention is going to change the world, and I'm going to get a windmill in every town, and then ends up as like, there wasn't even the mechanism for thinking about this, I think, right? But that's precisely the expectation we have in modernity, which is that an invention, why do people work on it? Well, they work on it precisely to create a device that is going to be mass-produced and going to be used as widely as possible. Mm-hmm. So it's
going to be experienced as a need.
As a need, yeah. Well, it's for the sake of its mass production. And in some ways, it's saying it's for the sake of profits. I don't mean that in like they just care about the money way. I think people love machines and love cool ideas, but they can only think about it in relation to a market that wants to get as much of it as possible. Mm-hmm. And so every new device sort of lives or dies on whether it becomes ubiquitous throughout society. And so when Illich is critiquing this, he's always critiquing the greed that inspires it in some way. Like, well, why not have a car? Because this is the thing. Cars are awesome.
Yeah.
And I think people don't understand this. Like, the problem with a car world is that it makes it impossible to realize how cool a car is. Mm-hmm. Because in a world built for cars are not exciting.
Yeah, it's just mundane.
Yeah. It'd be like, I don't know, a world built for skateboards. It'd be hard to be cool and a skateboarder in such a world.
Yep, that's true.
Already it's dubious, but it would definitely be true. Sorry, now I'm thinking about the way that skateboards are kind of like the like flip side of the car world, because they always use its... Let's not talk about that. Okay. The car is incredible. I mean, it's incredible to be able to move 75 miles per hour, but it's not incredible in a world built for it. So ideally what you have within a given society is the use of a particular technology.
Well, the use of a luxury for a luxury.
Yeah. Like, you want to travel very fast to go very far, because that's not normal. And we certainly don't need to design like daily living around it.
Right.
But let's have racetracks. That sounds great. Mm-hmm. And I think that people can get confused by this because they think that that what's always being proposed is some kind of like puritanical no to any given technology. But actually what's always being proposed is to have enough trust in the goodness of humanity as it's created to not make something extraordinary that we do create into something that we absolutely need to get by. Mm-hmm. Like, do not impute to humanity needs that it doesn't have.
Right.
And that's the hard part. That's the technological paradigm that throughout this issue of the magazine is critiqued again and again.
Yeah. Well, that was a question that I wanted to bring up because I do get questions like that on the new Polity email. Like people, like wanting to know like what's the new Polity take on technology, because I think there's a certain reactionary way of looking at Illich and saying, well, now that I see this, it means that I have to get rid of technology in my life, but I also know that's impossible.
And then you just do.
Yeah, so it creates in you like a sense of failure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's one of my questions when I was reading both of them is like, okay, well, what does this mean for me? Because I can see the ideal that he is pointing towards, and I know that's not going to happen in my lifetime. It's impossible for me to achieve, and it also requires dependence on other people. Like if I remove the car from my life, that doesn't mean that my world suddenly becomes walkable.
Yeah, exactly. You get a lot of rides.
But I think, well, one of the things you were pointing out earlier when we were talking was really helpful. That like one of the keys, and like why this conversation is important is because you want to be able to see reality for the way that it really is, and bring up the next generation of people who can actually see things for the way that they really are, and recognize that technology always brings with it a compromise. And is that a compromise that I really want to introduce into my life? Like, is this luxury, is this commodity, or using it in the way that is normal really worthwhile? And we're kind of in a bind because there aren't like good options. Like if you tell yourself like that introducing this technology into my life is going to bring compromise that I don't want, it means that you can't access certain things. You're not normal. I think I actually heard this on a Matt Fred podcast a long time ago
Fred.
I was really struck by, which was I think the conversation was about cell phones for kids, and he was like, look, either way you're damned. Like, your kid is just going to be a loser at school because he doesn't have a phone. He can't communicate in the way that everyone else is. Or if you want to keep a cell phone like out of their hands, well, I'm setting it up wrong. Yeah, like you're either, if you choose the better thing for the kid, which is not giving them a cell phone, then they are a loser. But then if you're giving a kid a cell phone, like, you're destroying their brain. So you're kind of in a lose-lose situation. I think, yeah, that's the place that you feel when you read critiques like Illich.
Yeah. I think it's not impossible. There's always a task ahead of us. The point of Christian politics is to make the world into the kingdom of God. And this is the church on earth as it brings all things into one in Christ. And we're just about that mission. That's what we do. But that doesn't mean that it's all done. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We'd be in heaven. So it's, first of all, just a matter of saying, okay, what is real? What's true about my time, and what tasks do I need to perform in order to bring the kingdom of God to earth? And so two of the things that I think we should do, one of them is to build pedestrian spaces, to have places that exclude cars, and to have forms of life really possible without cars. This is already true of lots of cities, but I think Catholics need to get behind it in a sincere way, because what it does to have a space in which cars aren't allowed but life is still attainable is it creates an education, or rather it creates an experience of a world that's genuinely possible. Like, here's a world in which you can get food from walking distance of your house, and at some point of this, you're not worried that if your kids move from 4 feet next to you, they might die.
Right.
And then what this allows for is an experience of a world in which the threat of death isn't omnipresent. And this allows us to imagine the possibilities of that expansion, so of removing that culture of death by degrees until eventually there, in fact, is no culture of death. And I think that starts with just using political power within local contexts to create pedestrian zones within downtowns in order to assert the goodness of moving about on feet.
Right.
And then hopefully using it as a pedagogical point at the same time.
You had a conversation with Sean, whose last name I'm blanking on.
Dvensic?
No. This was
Case? Sean.
I think it was a conversation with the guy who
Doherty?
runs Chattanooga Civics.
Sean. Oh, yeah.
Yes. It's really bad. I know your last name, and I was thinking about it earlier because I wanted to talk about it. I've forgotten it.
Now you're making me confused. I thought that was Nathan.
Oh, yeah, Nathan. That's really embarrassing.
Cut it.
Well, whoops, sorry, Nathan. Okay. I think if people are inspired by that part of the conversation, or like the idea of like, okay, I can make places in my city more walkable. That conversation I thought was really helpful from someone who's already like really involved with local politics, of how you get started with that, because it does seem like a pretty impossible task. So I just want to redirect people back to that podcast. I'll probably put the link in the description. I thought it was really good. Yeah.
And the other thing is
Nathan Bird. That's it.
Yeah.
Ha! I know you. I know who you are.
And the other thing is to I think get to know your car. So again, the problem with cars is the car world. And one of the ways that the car world operates is by making it all seem natural. Like it just seems like the world is for cars, and we can and we literally change topography to such an extent that it's very hard to imagine cars not having always been there, roads not having always been there. But what you want to do, what you're shooting for, is the production of a child who, as he grows into wisdom, is able to look at things like highways and say, I don't think we should have that there, and actually mean it, right? And have the political efficacy to change it, which you can't have unless you can see that the highway shouldn't be there, or that the highway is not a natural thing, but is in fact a choice, a decision, right? A difficult decision to undo, but in fact still just a human decision.
which requires, I mean, that's why this conversation is important, because a kid isn't going to have that experience, because a kid does experience the world as given, and so he's just going to assume that this is the way that things are, unless someone else brings him up into a different world or a different imagination.
And one of the things you learn when you're working on a car is its contingency as an artifact. So the way cars are presented increasingly to us is as things that we can't know from within, because it takes professional knowledge and certification in order to deal with it. And what that does is it alienates us from the very means of our own survival, in the sense of we need a car to live, and precisely the thing that we need to live is the thing that we can't possibly understand. This is definitionally alienation. Right? It's almost worse than alienation from the means of production, because it's alienation from, I said means of survival. I'll just say that again. Like it seems so basic. I mean, in the same way, this is why I don't like furnaces. But, but you see once you're under the hood of the car and you're looking for the starter, and you're cursing it, that it is a product of man. That not only is it a decision, but it's often a bunch of bad decisions. Like, why did they put this here? Right? I can't reach it. What tool do I need? I need that. And as you're working on it, it slowly unveils itself. It unveils those layers and layers of illusion by which it presents itself as this sort of impenetrable but necessary appendage. Right? Because think about an appendage. Like, you can't go into your leg and figure out how it works, because your leg's from God. Right? You can't while you're living anyways. You have to become a corpse. And the car is designed, increasingly all technology, phones especially, are designed to present themselves as appendages of our being, crutches, things that, because of their absolutization within culture, we need, we must have. And so our relationship to them becomes as to an extension of our body. Like
we need it, but we can't understand it.
I just simply have to use it, so that when it breaks, we're revealed to ourselves in our dependence, and we're full of fear. And we realize, your Honda Accord breaks, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, like, I have been taken out of the real. And now not only do I sort of exist as this sort of failure of humanity that can't achieve basic things like, buying a potato anymore, but also the car becomes a sacrament of everything else that we have the exact same relationship to. So it's like, well, if my car can break, then my furnace can break. I don't know how my furnace works. If my furnace can break, then my boiler can break. I don't know how my boiler works. I don't know it from within. About this before. Right? Like, I am dependent on almost every instance for the most basic things, like, I don't know, keeping a baby warm. I am dependent. The warmth of a baby in my care is dependent on my ability to continue to make cash and give it to someone who knows how to operate the thing. Right? To give me something that is so basic that so
I think this comes up in Hanby's article. It's like we're in a generation that has lost like a whole generation of knowledge. Like, there's just like basic things that we could do that we can no longer do. Like, I don't know how to, like, I don't take care of a horse, or I don't really know how to garden that well, or basic things to do to sustain my life. That knowledge is lost to me. And then his point was, like, you really don't think that this could happen with the most advanced technologies? Like, as soon as we fail to pass that onto one generation, we're all stuck, because now we don't even have the basic knowledge of how to survive.
Right. We've lost. I mean, I think about this in regards to breastfeeding, because it's not simply the case that, like, We've lost certain forms of knowledge. We also grow suspicious of forms of knowledge that are heavily reliant on things that we can't produce for money. So sort of non-technological means. So it's like there was literally a time within American society where it was kind of disgusting not to be feeding your baby formula.
Oh, yeah.
And where we almost did, it was sort of like a sudden gasp, a kind of collective gasp, that we almost lost this knowledge and skill of feeding children.
Yep.
Which is insane. like it doesn't seem like something that anyone could lose. If you explained yourself to people even like 100 years later and just described it as the time that we forgot how to breastfeed, they would think that you were just a cursed generation. But so there's so the point is that when you live within this world in which your survival is increasingly dependent on the mere operation of systems that you can't understand, can't fix, and don't know from within, then one of the solutions is very paradoxical, because it sounds like the opposite, is to actually dive in to the technology as an artifice. Like, stop giving it this kind of natural quality that you don't understand. Stop treating it like a weird
become its master
god.
essentially.
Yeah. Show it who's boss. Which, of course, it's funny because it's so hard to do that it's very obvious when you first. It's time consuming. And people talk about this with me sometimes, where I tell them that I'm working on this or that thing that's broken and trying to fix it, and they say things like, you know how to value your time. And I think what they mean is something to the effect of like, you're supposed to be writing or whatever, and so the time you spend doing this doesn't have an exchange value that does the math, right? Because if you paid a mechanic and then use the time that you had not used on fixing your car, of course, maybe that's all true, I don't know, but what I always want to say is, like, it's not about the money.
It's not about the money.
It's about freedom. Yeah, exactly. It is. It's about it is about looking up from that time spent wrestling with something that I'm actually a slave to, and then becoming its master in some respect. Like, come on, I know like how to fix 4 things on a car at this point. I'm just sort of learning as it breaks. Like, I'm not gonna like.
Great job, Marc.
Thank you. Yes. I'm not gonna like go and take a class or something. I'm just like, well, that's broken, and I gotta figure that out. But what doing even one thing to a piece of technology that otherwise alienates you does is it has you look up from the hood at the whole world, that suddenly you're existing in a new relationship too, because now you see the world of artifice as artifice. And so you're saying like, well, just as I can deal with this car as an artifact, so too maybe I can deal with the DMV as an artifact of man. Maybe I can like maybe the social mechanisms that seem to govern us without any chance of person and circumstance can be entered into, and their inner workings can be understood and then manipulated in some way. The idea is
like, you break the illusion of being a constant dependent, and you have to have that experience of it firsthand. Otherwise, it doesn't really sink in.
And that's the experience I have of people that are good at trades, like carpenters and stuff. I mean, they're great at carpentry, and I'm not saying that they're like just by virtue of that good at every other thing, but what they have is a lack of fear in regard to the built world. So when they look at it, they have this sort of present understanding that says, somebody built that.
Yeah.
And if somebody built that, then I can do it. Somebody made that. If somebody made that, it can be unmade. Like, they don't have a sense of relationship to the world where it's governed by fear. And so I think they're more able to take the call of Christ to be not afraid seriously and say, well, let me put it like this. I think they're enabled more easily to do politics.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, I think that's why Dr. Andrew Willard Jones is the way that he is, because, well
can't explain that, man, but
well, I just like know more of the stories from him growing up, and I don't know, if you meet academics, like, you just kind of assume that they have like a stuffy academic life, and that's their background, and that's not true of Andrew.
His dad was he an architect?
I don't know what his dad was. I just remember hearing stories about his summer jobs of working on fishing ships for a whole summer, or like riding horses before he could drive. I mean he kind of has an attitude of like fearlessness towards systems, and I think it's because at such a young age he had the experience of experiencing systems as being artifice, as being things that he could conquer as like a 16-year-old.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think what happens, especially these days within like Catholic political thought, is that we've had such a huge dose of libertarianism that people react in the other way, where they say like that the point, what I mean is people saying things like, screw the system, you're an individual, you get to do what you want, etc. You create a kind of political atmosphere in which the reaction to that is something like, love the system, make the system the best system, etc. When obviously both are equally dumb. Like it's just a sort of, they're the same thing. What you need is the ability to restore what is missing to politics, and that is the dispensation, the possibility of dispensation of law. You need the possibility of any system being amenable to person and circumstance, because it's still governed and put in place by man with intention and decision. It's like, if we're going to have a bureaucratic management for the sake of the production of ID cards, fine. Like maybe I can imagine a situation when that is necessary to meet certain problems. But let's do it in such a way that it is always available to human judgment, to politics. Like let's do that in such a way in which the person who administers the law is actually able to say, hey, in your circumstance, it doesn't apply. One form of ID is fine.
Yeah.
Hey, I can see you're not that good at bureaucracies. That's okay. There's people like you world over. Come on in.
Yeah, to kind of go back to an earlier idea that I was thinking about, like being a good Christian is not being good at following the law, but actually being in a position to judge the law and judge it with prudence and wisdom. To being able to see like here's the system, and here's the natural law, and like I have the position of being able to judge whether or not that system actually coheres with what is true and what is good for the human person. And it gives you, it puts you in a real place of authority, and it requires, you can't do that sort of thing mindlessly. Like it takes work to get to the place where you can judge the law effectively. Like you have to grow in virtue. Like you have to like embody the law first, not the like bureaucratic law, but the moral law, so that you can judge it. I mean, I wonder if that's another like good mindset to be like training children in, like doing like exercises where like you can like actually judge the law. Like I remember growing up, like it just wasn't like you don't really question the rules that like the school system has or the teacher has, or maybe like my parents would question it, but they wouldn't do that with me because they didn't want me to grow up questioning authority. And I don't think that was the best move. Like I think it's perfectly like reasonable to just have an open conversation, like judging the rules that other people are making, so that like your kid is brought up into a world where their imagination is larger of what the world could be, because they don't just accept human artifice as being given.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Paul says, do you not know you will judge angels? Angels, right? Like, there is much more required of us. And this is why in another essay in this marvelous magazine that everyone should buy, Ratzinger talks about he's so very subtle about this, but he talks about this relationship between technology as we have it now and an old heresy we call tutorism, which is like legalism.
Is it tutorism or tutiorism?
That's a good question. I don't know. I thought it was just a tutor.
It's probably not that important.
It's extremely important, because then I can say something like, you put the I... No, it don't work. It don't work. Let's see.
I got it.
What page?
16. Tutiorism.
Tutiorism, thank you.
That's not a spelling error. maintains that man, in making a decision, must guide himself according to the given laws, and thus must always choose that option which corresponds most surely to the law in that and in each case. That means that it is not a conformity to reality that leads to a decision, but the positivistic security of a direction derived from the law.
Yeah, and so he's saying this is something condemned by the church in reference to morality and to salvation. Like, you cannot achieve salvation simply by following the law. So, I mean, old idea, actually, that's being condemned. But in some ways, this is what a absolutized technocratic state suggests to us, right? Where it replaces our contact with the real with sort of impenetrable systems that the navigation of which leads to certain rewards that we mistake for eternal reward. Like, we mistake it for successful and good life,
we mistake
lived.
it for like real, the real.
And I do think you're right that raising children to be judges of the law, it's not simply I mean, obviously it is a process, right? Like, you need to be obedient in order to realize that the law is for the sake of a certain end and can be judged in terms of its attainment of that end. This is why we talk about judging the spirit of the law or following the spirit of the law, like where we are able to say, well, you know, something obvious like, well, the law is that I have to drive this fast, but the reason for the law is to keep people safe. And right now, if I don't drive really fast, this woman is going to die. And, you know, I'm imagining a woman like shot in the back of the car, and I'm rushing her to the hospital, to be clear. So I obey the spirit of the law. I break its letter. Those distinctions, if they're not being delivered to children, they simply aren't going to produce Christians, except for a name, I think. Because that is the new law, right? It's on our hearts now, and not just as like a like deeper servility to a written law, but a law that we actually assent to with our hearts because it's God's law and it's real, and we can freely assent to it as opposed to doing so in a servile fashion. Well, should probably stop talking.
Yeah, I think that.
So if you want to sort of start the exploration of a Catholic theory of technology, I would start with issue 3.4 of New Polity magazine.